So my name's Javier Peres. I founded Peres Projects, a contemporary art gallery, in 2002. I originally started the gallery in San Francisco, California. And then in 2003, I moved it to Los Angeles. In 2005, I opened a second location in Berlin. And from 2005 to 2010, we had main locations in Los Angeles and Berlin. In addition to that, during that period, we also had project spaces in New York in collaboration with an artist called Terrence Coe. It was called the Asia Zong Society. And then we also had a project space in Greece for a while that I operated as part of this initiative called Remap, which was started actually by a very good friend of mine here in Greece, who develops land and things. And then currently, we have locations in Berlin, in Seoul, and in Milan. And I think just part of my background, I think that a lot of people know I used to be an attorney, and I practiced law mostly in the US, but also in Europe. I did it. It seems now to me I did it or at the time it seemed like it was a long time, but now in retrospect, since I've had the gallery for over 21 years now, actually, it seems like it was a very brief period that I actually practiced law, relatively speaking. But at the time, it was a big part of how I started the gallery. Was very informed by the structure of the way I ran my part of the business within the law firm. I worked for a very large law firm with offices. I think we were in 19 countries or something like that. But I was quite involved in the management of it during the first .com boom. I was in San Francisco, in Silicon Valley during that period, which was a very pivotal sort of period in the world of technology, and really in the world that we know today. I used to represent all the big companies of that time, Oracle, Google, Sybase, Microsoft, and I also worked with companies in other sectors, most notably in the entertainment field. I also worked with a lot of companies in sports and also major sports, so like baseball, basketball, hockey. And also worked with a lot of companies in other aspects of the tech and also like automotive sector. So Mercedes and all these kinds of things. I worked in law. I started working in the field in 1996, 97, and I stopped in 2002. So it was actually, in the grand scheme of things, it was a relatively brief period, now. But at the time, it was my whole professional career, because I did a classic sort of American education. I went to undergraduate school. I studied international relations and diplomacy. I did half of it in America, in Washington, D.C., and then I did half of it between Belgium, Brussels, and Madrid, Spain. I had a focus on European diplomacy, and then I went straight into law school. And I initially was interested in the field of human rights and international law. And so I was working in that area. When you're still in law school, you can even go to court as long as you go under the supervision of a licensed attorney. So because during that time, there was a lot of global conflicts happening around the world. Most notably, there was the war in Sierra Leone, the civil war in Sierra Leone, and in Liberia. There was also the starting of the problems in Eritrea and Somalia. And so Washington, D.C. was basically, a safe haven for people coming from these areas. And so I worked on a lot of those kind of human rights cases, political asylum cases. And that was the area that I was very interested in. That's always, most people know about my interest in art. There's a couple of other major aspects of interest for me. One has always been human rights, political rights, And the other part, which is related to art, is ancient art. That's another field that I'm very passionately interested in, and I'm quite involved in it, particularly in the field of classic African art. So all these things kind of, it doesn't seem like it, but they all tie in together. It's just not always so obvious, but for me, they all made sense. Absolutely. The one is a personal private passion, and the other is also a personal private passion and also a professional passion. When I decided to leave the law firm, the reason I did it was because I wanted to start a gallery. For some reason, I mean, there was a series of events, both personal things in my family, and then also I saw a very important exhibition of the work of Eva Hesse at SF MoMA. And Eva Hesse was an artist who died quite tragically in a way. She was very young, but she left behind a sizable body of work. And she died of like a brain tumor. And it just kind of, I don't know, that it's something about her story really touched me. It reminded me of the fragility of life. It reminded me of the importance of art and the importance of recognizing these two things somehow. And for me, for some reason, I don't know exactly why, that made it my goal to start a gallery focusing on contemporary artists. I immediately wanted to be a part of defining what the history of art would be. Something that we've always strived at Peres Projects from the very beginning was to focus on art that's immediate, art that is of the moment. I've had many opportunities over the years, and at times I have dabbled a bit in the secondary market works, in historical works. I come from a family that has access to those kinds of things because my grandparents collected modern art. And so I've had many opportunities. I've had many clients over the years, like, please, like, you should do a show. I mean, I remember back in the day where they were like, do a show of like Bryce Marden and Joe Bradley or Dan Colin, do a show of like Onkawara and Terrence Coe, or Yoko Ono and Terrence, or Yayoi Kusama and Terrence. Like, I had all these opportunities to do these kinds of things, and they're interesting, but it wasn't ever really what motivated me. I've always been more passionate about art that is of the moment, and as an anecdotal thing, when I was younger, when my grandparents, my grandmother was the one who kind of controlled the direction of my grandparents' art collecting, and also informed a lot of my education in art history and what was important and why not, but always with a focus on collecting. And her thing was, collect art of your time. We'll give you money to buy art only if you buy art of your time. Like, one time I was buying a Dubuffet drawing, and she got so upset because she's like, why, like, like, Dubuffet's an old man. You're 13 years old. Why are you even looking at Dubuffet? Dubuffet's irrelevant to you. And of course, part of it was my grandmother was very competitive, and she was like, that's things that she collected. She didn't want us to be collecting the same things. But for her, it was like almost a conflict of interest, and she certainly wasn't going to finance it. And so in a nutshell, that was kind of the things that motivated me at the time. And we have really steadfastly remained that. The gallery has changed dramatically over the years. My role has changed dramatically over the years. Like, I don't really work at any of the galleries. I don't work at the gallery in Seoul. I'm sure you've seen that I'm not there very often. I'm in Seoul with some frequency, but not even when I'm there, I'm not at the gallery. The same thing in Berlin. I don't live in Berlin. And in Milan, I do live in Milan, but I don't go to the gallery so often. I'm not so involved in the day-to-day operations of the gallery at all anymore. But the thing that's always remained at the core of what we do, and I think what people appreciate about what we do, is that we are a place of discovery, a place of innovation, and really a place of learning, because ultimately contemporary art is about learning, and it's collecting in the field of contemporary art and presenting contemporary art is about collaborating and using those collaborations as a point of reference for, communicating, educating, and learning new things that maybe we wouldn't automatically be so in tune with. So this question is a bit challenging to answer because I had no idea what I was doing. Okay. Now, I come from a family that is used to starting businesses. And so I had been involved since a young age in that aspect. And also because in my legal practice, I was constantly exposed to brand new companies. I saw people starting companies all the time, I mean, during that period, it was very common for one of my clients to leave the company that was my client and start another company that then became my client, so I was very used to the idea of starting up, as it were. Right. However, I had no idea about the business of selling art whatsoever. In fact, at the beginning, I mean, a couple of times, like the big discussion in my family was like, they're like, wait, so you're actually selling the art? Why are you selling it? It's so great what you're doing. Why don't you just keep everything? And I was like, well, can't really do that. It doesn't work that way because I come from a collecting family. My grandparents that I know of, my grandparents never sold anything. They donated a lot of works. A lot of works were confiscated by the communist government in Cuba when they came into power. They stole a lot of the collection that was in Cuba at the time, which is now like in the national museums there, or I think a lot of it also left Cuba and it got sold elsewhere, but that's a different story. So I did not come from a background of commercializing art or commercializing culture. On the contrary, we were like in my family, we talked about, oh, why is this interesting? Why is it important? Or like, why is it nonsense? And it was more about, we came at it both from a historical and a culture perspective because for us, like art defines culture. And, I come from a very small island in the Caribbean. And so defining our culture as Cubans is very important. My family origins are in the north of Spain. And also they come from these like small minority regions. So culture is very important. And it's a vehicle that serves as a mirror of like who we are, which I think is the case across the world, whether you come from a small population or a larger population. So when I started the gallery, I mean, when I look back now, I did so many things so stupidly. Like back then, for example, I was really into wines and like really fancy, expensive wines. I also had clients who own vineyards and things. Yeah. So at my openings, I was like serving like $500 bottles of wine. And of course, you have all these young artists coming and getting hammered, totally drunk off the most expensive, like literally I would spend $20,000, $30,000 in an opening just on wine. And it was from my own reserves, right? It was my own wine reserves. So I was all of a sudden depleting all of my wine because I was like, oh, that's what you do. You serve wine. That's what I wanted to drink. So that's what I wanted to give people. So I did a lot of stupid things like that. The other thing that was like very curious now, and I'll share this with you because it's something I don't know that I've talked about very often. Part of the reason I called the gallery Peres Projects, it was always a gallery, but I wanted to be a project-based gallery, meaning that I was going to do 3 exhibitions with an artist. And after the 3rd exhibition, I would no longer work with them. I would move on to other artists because I always wanted to work with a lot of artists. And I didn't necessarily think that it was important to have another gallery in the ecosystem that had a stable of artists that only worked with those artists. At that time, that was my thinking. I thought, oh, that'll be interesting. Well, what I didn't take into account was that as you progressed with these exhibitions with the artists, you were investing a lot into them. And I was producing all the art. I've always like worked with artists who produce things and get big installations and things. And so there was a lot of output, but not a lot of return. And I also noticed that with several of my artists, by the time we had done even the second show, already their star was rising, right? They were getting invited to, like, I mean, at one point, I think I had like 8 artists in the Whitney Biennial, you know, like I'm talking about in 2004, when I had been in business for, you know, barely a year and a half later, I had like 8 artists that either I represented or who I was showing in a lot of exhibitions, group exhibitions and things. And so I realized, I was like, wait, that idea is so foolish, because you can't like champion an artist and then say, hey, other gallery, oh, by the way, I was in California. Back then, the world was very different. The American art world was completely controlled by New York. And in fact, you know, New York had a really like a major sort of hegemony, I would say, in the larger scheme. You know, the world has really changed since then in that regard. And so I quickly realized, no, scrap that idea, this 3-show thing. You know, I remember even telling the artist, hey, by the way, we're not doing the 3-show thing anymore. We represent you, you know, like we're moving on from that idea. So I did a lot of like kind of like silly things like that, but I've always been very interested in innovation, adaptability. You know, I'm very quick to change courses when it's necessary. You know, I mean, I think I'm fortunate in a way that because of my own history and my family history, I'm very adaptable. So I can change. I can assimilate very easily to changing situations, and I'm not afraid of change. On the contrary, I actually like change. I know for a lot of people, especially even as they get older, they're like, oh God, like they just want to keep it the same way. And I'm the exact opposite. I'm like, oh yeah, let's try something different, you know? And so we're constantly doing that. And we encourage this type of innovation within the gallery. And we've been doing that now, you know, really, we've been doing it from the beginning because that was, for me, normal. Something like that. I mean, yeah, I definitely didn't. Yeah, I mean, I also, listen, in the country that I was born, I was a foreigner. And then when we went to the country that I was supposed to be from, I was a foreigner. I've always been like a foreigner, you know, and I like it, you know, like I'm very adaptable to that. And it's really informed my mindset. I definitely did not expect the gallery to be around that long. And in fact, you know, all of the big players that came around that time are pretty much, they've all gone. I think the only other gallery that opened actually a little bit after I did was David Kordansky's gallery. He opened like a year or two after I did in Chinatown in LA as well. But like, you know, there was like Zach Foyer and Daniel Reich and John Connolly Presents. They were like very important young galleries. And they've all since closed, and they all showed artists who became huge, you know, Dana Schutz and oh my gosh, oh my God, Cuban artist shows at Lehman Maupin. Oh my God, I could see his face and I can't remember his name now. Anyhow, like a lot of very important artists came out of that period, you know, from all of us. But I think part of the reason why it worked for us is that because the gallery continues to evolve and will continue to evolve. You know, I always worked on 5-year plans. I mean, it's a very, you know, I grew up under communism, so it was always, plans were always 5 years. And we've now started doing a 20-year plan for the next 20 years. And it's something, you know, that I'm involved in, and kind of just looking at how the landscape is going to continue to change, how we're going to change with it, and how we're going to help change it, you know, because I mean, when I think about it now, maybe it sounds corny, but I remember even like the way we used to install at art fairs, like no galleries used to install that way. We used to install very like salon, very ad hoc. And I remember like some of like the big galleries were like, what are they doing? It looked like such a mess. And then 2 years later, 3 years later, they were all doing it. I remember when we first started using iPads at art fairs, people were like, what are you doing with an iPad? A year later, everybody had iPads. I remember when I did interviews like this very early on, again, because I came from a different world. The question was, are people buying art via email? And that was a huge topic because in the art world of the late 90s, early 2000s, people bought art at the fairs, at the galleries, and you would mail them transparencies. You literally, like a plastic photograph printed on plastic, they would put it on a box or look at it in the light and say, yeah, I want that painting, and then they would send it back to you because those transparencies were part of your archive. That's how you kept everything in an archive. Nothing was digitized. And from the very beginning, I had a database because I worked with all these clients who did relational database management systems. And so I had a database built for my gallery from the very beginning. I had an archive, a digital archive developed for the gallery from the very beginning. I wasn't doing a lot of those kinds of things, which of course now we think about it and we're like, oh, like that nobody would even think to ask that question. It's an irrelevant question now. But at that time, it was new. It was totally new. Yeah, I mean, LA is a very interesting place. LA is still a microcosm. I think most people, when you ask them really about the LA art world, it's the artists that make LA. There's a lot of artists in LA, and as a result, a lot of galleries have gone to LA because they want to be where the artists are. But the LA art market in of itself, it's a very small market, relatively speaking. I mean, it definitely, I mean, it's grown quite a bit. It's grown because the demographics of collecting have grown. Much younger people collect art. Also, LA is, I mean, America is a very complicated place. There's really, in the reality, there's only a few places in America that you could live. And at least if you're sort of like aware. I mean, it's a very, I haven't lived there in a very long time, and so it's a very unusual place. But LA is a bit of like a haven, and so you have a lot of international people who come to Los Angeles. So there's constantly this renewal. Also, LA, I mean, to this day, my clients in California, by and large, come from the entertainment industry because they are also adapt to change. They're interested in like what's happening, what's new, what they're more open-minded, right? And so LA has always had that, but back then, if you look at the number of galleries, it was a very small group of galleries that were kind of making it, and of course for a long time you had like the really big sort of powerhouse galleries, right? Blum and Poe, Regan Projects. My gosh, my memory sometimes for names is so bad. And so I know I'm forgetting a couple of other like sort of very important players from that time. But those are the ones also that are still very much around, and then you of course you had these waves that came in afterwards, but they were relatively small compared to what was happening in other places. Yeah, I mean, for a lot of different reasons, from the very beginning, I've always had clients in Asia, like literally from day one. Also, I had a lot of Asian clients from the diaspora. In fact, for a long time, definitely my favorite client in California was an Asian couple. And one guy is from Taiwan and the other one is from Vietnam. Both ethnic Chinese people. I did Art Hong Kong before it became Art Basel, I think in 2009 or something like that. And we had shows at the Hughes Museum, like in the 2000s, or with different foundations at the beginning when there was all these new foundations in China, also in Korea. I actually, I realized recently that Space K Museum, where Donna Wonka just had a big show, the chairman of the collection, I sold him a work of Dash No, I think in 2007 or 2008, something like that, So I've had a lot of exposure by very actively pursuing it from the get-go. And, Korea for us was like a natural sort of place because it's more integrated into sort of the global economy, the cultural economy. Korea is more progressive. It just made sense, from a market perspective, from like a working perspective. For us, it made the most sense to be like the first place. And then on top of that, I happen to have a very dear friend of mine whose family owns the building where the gallery is, for example, who really was a driving force, I would say, in those early stages of thinking about opening a space in Seoul. And then also like the family that owns Art Busan, they were also very supportive. Their son was in Berlin, so we became very close to him as well. Me particularly. But the other question, as far as like the program, the gallery has one program. The gallery has different locations, and in the future could have more or less locations or new locations, but there's always one program. We don't really distinguish what we're going to show. It's a matter of timing. There's strategic thinking, of course, like if an artist is having a show in an institution in Seoul, we won't do a show of her work at the exact same time so that the institution can sort of get the time that it needs and the attention their show needs to get. But then we'll follow up 6 months later, 12 months later with a show of that artist, for example, as an idea. But the program remains the same. And the reason why we have these galleries and why we always had like the different project spaces and things too was so that we can sort of fulfill our mission of showing global art to a global audience. For me, it was never really interesting to only focus on one place, and that was very clear to me from the very beginning. When I first started the gallery in LA, like majority of my clients were not in LA. Like back in the day, my major clients was Charles Saatchi in London, Dakis Joannou in Athens, Hans Rasmus Astrup, who owns, he's deceased now, but the Astrup Fearnley Museum. He founded the Astrup Fearnley Museum in Oslo. I also worked a lot with a private collector in the south of Italy, who was at the time very, very active. And he had a very successful business and had been very interested in contemporary art since he was a young guy. And so he and I had this bond over the fact that we kind of grew up, as just young guys who always liked art. I started buying art when I was a teenager, and so it was a very like kind of weird thing because I had my normal life as a teenager, but then I had my sort of like this hobby that like, my friends were playing video games. I was like, video games? I was like, I still don't understand, I don't know that world, because I was reading books on art history. I was going to museums. I was going to art galleries, so that was my education. And that's our goal with the galleries really, is to present a very high level of exhibitions, no matter where you go, and really so that there's continuity. And it's a challenge because, of course, there are, for example, the Seoul Gallery doesn't close for the summer break, which for the European galleries, they're like, what? Like, that's impossible. The Seoul Gallery is like, that's crazy that you guys are closing during the summer when people can go to galleries, so there are some of these like minor cultural differences that we have adjusted to, but by and large, the goal is to have really like a unified sort of trajectory of exhibitions. And of course, each space is unique. Our space in Berlin is a magnificent space. It's in the sort of high Soviet style architecture from the 1950s. The Karl Marx Allee is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the entire boulevard, and we have this huge space on the ground floor. Our space in Milan is in a historic palazzo that belongs to the Sforza family. They were one of the great, and they are one of the great banking families of Italy, on the same level as the Medicis. and where the building was made by the same architect who did La Scala. La Scala is a block and a half away from the gallery. So it's a very beautiful location. The space in Seoul is in this amazing location near the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art, near the Royal Palace, near all the principal historic Korean galleries. And it's 70s building, and of course we updated the interior, right? So each space kind of reflects the spirit of its location. So that's where the things differ. And that, of course, like you're seeing in the background, the installation of Ad Minoliti, that's a show that, for example, in Milan would look very different because the building is so imposing, and the historic nature of the building wouldn't allow for an intervention of this level. To some degree, yes, but it would be different because we can't, for example, cover the floor. The floor is this beautiful mosaic, The word that I would use rather than contemporary is immediate, right? It's our focus is on showing art that is of the moment, that speaks to the moment, and that in a way is a mirror. And now that doesn't always mean that we're aware of it, because sometimes society can't see the very thing that it is. And that's part of what is so interesting about working with contemporary artists, because contemporary artists sometimes have this sensibility of something that is about to happen or that will happen. And for us, it's a very compelling aspect of what we do. For us, a great artist is one that's able to tell stories, right? She's someone who has this vision for sharing an aspect of the world or of their life or of something that they're very passionate about in a way that isn't necessarily accessible to us yet, right? We don't know it. You take an artist like, let's say, Malika Kara. Malika Kara is a German-born artist of Kurdish descent, right? And her work digs very deeply into archives, historical archives, personal archives, family archives, with this very interesting cultural group that is very misunderstood, has been heavily persecuted, that most of us around the world, myself included, had never heard of until I met her, or until we saw that there was politically, we were like, wait, there's conflict between Turkey and the Kurdish people. What's happening? And then we started to learn more about it. Her work goes really deep into that. And she makes these really beautiful works that are, on the one hand, also informed by German Expressionism, right? She studied the Kunstakademie in Dusseldorf. So she has this very strong academic background. She studied under Rosemarie Truckel. And so she can work in a variety of mediums. The mediums don't matter. She does installations. I mean, most people, when they think of her, they think of the paintings. I mean, even like the Pompidou, when they acquired her work recently, they acquired a huge installation. They acquired several paintings. I go to the Pompidou a few months back, and I just see the painting. And I was like, okay, they didn't show all the other stuff, and that's what people know of her work, right? And so, but her work is super interesting because it opens up this whole world. And it opens up our eyes to a part of the world, the Ottoman world, right? The Turkish world, which is huge and hugely, actually my business partner, Nick, is in Istanbul right now on holiday. And he was sending me pictures of this like aqueducts built in the 5th century BC that are still in use today. And you're like, what? And they're pristine, they're gorgeous. We're talking about a cultural group that at one point, was one of the great societies of the world, one of the leading economic, social, scholastic, intellectual, artistic centers of the world. And so I'm interested in that. I'm interested in artists who are able to bring us into these stories that they want to tell. An artist like Ad Minoliti, combining this, ecofeminism and this very humanistic approach to art, right? Also a very inclusive approach to art, right? They are doing art that deals with childhood, so an area that most of us don't think about, you know, and how our early years inform everything, you know, like they're so important. And it's interesting that very few artists, I mean, the only other artist that I think of that really deals with that in a, but he does it in a very sometimes weird, peculiar way, is Jeff Koons. Like, right, Jeff Koons is very interested in infancy and childhood, right? And of course, we know that he had quite a traumatic experience with the custody of his child and all these things. And so he's made basically these artworks that are toys for the son that he lost, you know, where we have Admin Aliti making their work about, you know, how do we reconcile with a more inclusive and a more approachable way of dealing with our childhood memories, our childhood, our education. And at the same time, you know, sort of recognizing some of the implications of not doing it the right way, not doing it in a way that is supportive of life and supportive of free thinking, you know. So that's the kind of stuff that we're always looking for. It's not that we have like a criteria or like a kind of like a checklist, you know, of like, oh, like, you know, she makes a good painting. Like, that's great. Like, she learned how to paint well in art school. That's not enough for us. That just means you're able to regurgitate, you know. And there's some people who become, you know, so good at regurgitating that they create something monumental, right? I mean, you know, Picasso always talked about, you know, copying and, you know, being able to copy so well that you totally altered it, you know. Sturtevant, right? Another artist who kind of mastered the idea of making replicas that became their own work. So conceptually super brilliant and interesting. But for us, we're interested in stories. We're interested in in the people who have the ability to really like share these things that we sometimes just overlook, you know. Like for us, art that's immediate, that's contemporary, is able to teach, you know. And it's about also building collections. I mean, that's a big part of what we've always done is, you know, we like to work with people who want to build collections of art, right? I know we'll get into it soon in the question of, you know, the market aspect of it, which is an interesting question. And I you know, I often say that I'm actually I'm not a good source for information in that, you know, because although I am involved in the commercializing of art, you know, that's a very small part of what we do as a gallery. The other 95% of what we do is, you know, putting the building blocks of art history together and then helping people engage with those building blocks and to add them to their lives. And so it's a very sort of very specific and very sort of unique occupation, you know, that we have, and the kind of role that we play in that, you know. The process has undergone major shifts over the years. At the start, it was all around me. It was all about who I discovered, you know. I mean, I can tell you, like, the sort of core first group of artists, I brought them together kind of like almost like as an extended family, but they all knew each other. So like that core group of artists at the beginning was, you know, I met Terence Coe through Bruce LaBruce, right? Terence grew up in Canada and Bruce was obsessed with him. And I was obsessed with Bruce, so I met Terence. Through Terence, I met Dan Colin. I met Dash Snow through Dan Colin. I met Ryan McGinley through him. I met Agat Snow through them. That whole group of artists. And then Dan studied with Joe Bradley. I think Dan was an undergraduate. Joe was a graduate student. And so that initial thing happened. It wasn't by accident per se, but it was because of speaking with those artists and then hanging out with them and seeing what they were interested in. You know, like I remember like when I first met Joe was because he was having a show in New York and the show was amazing, but they barely sold any of it. And Dan was like, listen, like, can you meet this friend of mine? He's the best painter out of RISD. And it's crazy that he's having this show and nobody cares about it. So I came and I bought everything that was left in the show. I think they had sold 2 works. So I bought like 5 or 6 works. That was the totality of the show. And then I immediately called a couple of these, Saatchi and, the Norwegians and stuff. And I was like, hey, I have these works. They're amazing. You should buy these works too. So I kept some, they bought some. And then we started working with Joe Bradley, because the gallery that he was working with was struggling to sell those works because they were more like an artist run kind of deal. I mean, I was so naive. I didn't know how the art world worked at that time, So, and I was a collector dealer. I was doing both things. I was still, I was very much collecting and very much dealing at the same time. And I was also collecting and dealing artists that I didn't even work with. Like when I bought all those works by Joe Bradley, I initially bought them because I thought they would look great in my living room. And I was like, oh, these are amazing. It was the modular paintings, the robots, the people, as they called them. And it was amazing. I mean, one of those robots later, I think I bought it for $6,000. We later sold it for $3 million. And so, so that was that initial way of the way we were working. It was very much like connecting to people, connecting to artists. I've never cared about where you're from. I've never cared about, how you identify per se, or where you studied, what year you were born. I know even to this day, I know, for example, in Korea, people are always like, what year were they born? And I'm always like, I have no idea. I'm always like, oh, they're like 30 something, and then Casey will be like, 32, they're like, okay, see, I was right, like something in the 30s. For me, that kind of stuff isn't interesting. As a result, I did, from very early on, I showed a lot of artists from sort of minority backgrounds, things that now have become sort of more normal. At that time, it was less normal. It was actually kind of not what you did, the very first artist I showed in San Francisco was a South African artist, Bernie Searle, super important artist from the continent. She had been in the Venice Biennale, she's queer. So it's like showing a queer African artist. It was like, I don't know what to me, it seemed normal, but it wasn't normal in that world. 20 odd years later, the way we work, we have a team within the gallery that's led by Nick, who oversees all of sort of the artist development, artist relations, working with artists, looking at new artists. I give feedback. I'm constantly looking. I'm constantly, both for collecting for myself, collecting for friends, but also just for because that's what I like to do. When people ask me what's my job, what's my hobby, I'm like, well, it's the issue. It's the same thing. I don't have this distinction between the two worlds. And so we have a system now of then developing, doing studio visits, conversations, often bringing artists to Berlin. The first South Korean artist that we're going to work with, Yeon Ryu, she's doing a residency with us right now in Berlin, something that we do quite a bit, which is super amazing because it allows us to work very closely with them while they're making a body of work to really kind of understand what makes the person tick. Because ultimately, for us, we're building relationships too with the artist, right? And then a relationship that we have to communicate, and so we have our writing team, we have our research team there. They can all go in, they can meet with the artist as the works are happening. Sometimes they can also help guide the artist through what is it that they're trying to express. Sometimes some artists are very good at creating, but they're not so great at expressing what their creation is about. It's in them, but they don't always have the language for it. Sometimes the language doesn't exist. We don't have the language either sometimes. So we help, we collaborate on figuring out, how do you express what this is about? So that's in a nutshell, that's how it's done. And it's done almost entirely out of Berlin. And as I said, I'm not in Berlin very often. I haven't lived there for a couple of years. So I'm not involved in the day-to-day, but I'm constantly getting feedback on and then I give feedback and, are we looking at this? Do we know more information about this? Why? It's always a lot of asking questions. And sometimes there's no answer to the question, and that's fine. Every question doesn't need an answer. Sometimes it's just enough to use it as a starting point to think about. I think, galleries are really, really important, and and the importance of galleries, I think, actually is bigger today than it's ever been. And I think that's the direction where it's going. That's my perspective. I think some people disagree with that, but I'll say why I think that. I mean, for one, is that for every 10,000 artists, there's one gallery. Like for every 100,000 artists, there's one good gallery that connects well with that artist. So the ecosystem is very tipped on, there's just fewer of us. And the role that we play is, we're in the, not in the middle, in the traditional way of thinking of the middleman, because we are the facilitator for showing, communicating, contextualizing, discussing, archiving, all the stuff that, frankly, most artists don't have the resources, the energy, the time to do all of those things. I mean, that's why even, you have, take an artist like Damien Hirst, very wealthy guy. He even did an auction of all new works of himself, right? 2018 in London, first time that's ever been done. He still shows with galleries. He still needs the galleries, even when he got the thing together to do something so radical like that, which I thought was very interesting and in a way cool that he did that. It was kind of, I mean, at that stage in his career, he's very much an artist where it's about the value of things and, the money associated with art. And he was like, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to sell it myself. But yet he still works. He still needs White Cube. He still needs Gagos. He still needs those kind of galleries. And so the role of galleries is really paramount to also filtering things, because I remember, I mean, this is kind of a funny thing, like my grandparents, I mean, they're from a very strange generation in a way too, maybe, I don't know. I'll just tell you, to me, it's a bit weird when I think about it, but my grandparents never wanted to meet the artist. They were not interested. They were interested in the art, and they were like, the art has to speak. We don't want to speak to the artist. And it was a complete opposite of how I approach it and how I work. But it was really interesting. So they would speak to the art dealers, right? To art historians. They really cared what art historians thought. They really cared what museums thought. But they didn't care so much about what the artists had to say. And we're talking about the world, from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. It's a different period. Now, in the era that we're living in, galleries are able to mobilize communities around what they're doing. You have galleries popping up in parts of the world that didn't have galleries at all. I mean, in China, like the number of great galleries in China nowadays, 30 years ago, they didn't exist, In Seoul, what's happening in Seoul and in Korea in general, both with, domestic galleries and international galleries. Berlin, I was the first foreigner to open a gallery in Berlin, like at an international kind of level, and at the time everybody was like, you're crazy. Why would you leave Los Angeles to open a gallery in Berlin? And, I don't have German clients. They're not a major source of our business. They never have been, but it was an important place to exhibit. And it was an important place for artists to show. And so, but those were all decisions that we as a gallery made. And so our role there was quite vital, and I think this is something that will continue to be the case. And you're seeing it now when you look at the really large galleries, the global galleries. I mean, they are opening spaces, they're like Prada stores. They're like at any place where there would be the possibility of somebody acquiring art, they have a place. And so it's an interesting indicator of where things are going, and the fact that the role of galleries are just they're super important. And it's, of course, it's symbiotic. Like galleries need to take into account the needs and wants of artists, and vice versa. There has to be an equilibrium, and that's something that I learned also at the beginning. I didn't realize that in the beginning. I thought I have to put forward all the effort, make it as easy as possible. Basically, it was almost like treating the artist almost like a child almost, like they can't do it, I have to do everything, that's not really, it's not really healthy for anybody, and as a gallery, for us, our team is as important to us as the artists that we work with. We really want to have an environment that is conducive to to everybody having the right type of life, and the artists can't do what we do, and we can't do what they do. So there has to be like this level of communication, kind of solidarity, respect. When we talk about art, it's sort of like when you talk about like medicine, and there's like different doctors that specialize in different things. The art world is very similar. You can be like super knowledgeable, like brain doctor, but you can't cure heart disease. You can't cure eczema, and the art world is similar. There's people who are artists, who are showing their things on Instagram and selling it, and it becomes a thing. And sometimes then it even gets picked up by a gallery, and it has like this moment. Of course, and some of them become, the moment continues. Others don't. There's room for that. The art market, the art business, the art world, however you want to refer to it, has a high level of sort of absorbability and inclusivity, but that doesn't mean that the galleries, for example, don't play a more important role overall. And that's something that a lot of people, especially people who are sort of new to the art world, get confused by. And it can be confusing. It's sort of, we've all heard the person who doesn't understand art who says, "Oh, but like, why would I pay $1,000 for that? Like, my child could do it." And you always smile and you go, "You're right. You should buy the one from your child, and live with that, like, great, congratulations, or you can have a more frank conversation with them, like, oh, it's interesting what you're saying about your brilliant child. In fact, in our history, there's been many artists who have actually tried to abandon everything they learned scholastically in order to paint more childlike. You might know some of them, Picasso, Dubuffet. There's a whole movement around that, so, there's different ways of looking at the things. There's legitimacy in all of it, but it doesn't really change, like, even when you think about, like, with institutions, institutions want to work with galleries when they're doing exhibitions, because they need the knowledge, they need the support, they need the know-how, which very few artists can do that on their own. Certainly they can't do it over Instagram. I love Instagram. I've sold things to people who I've met. I have several clients that I originally met via Instagram who have become like legitimate, like, forces in their regions, and when they're doing very interesting things, have open foundations and all this stuff. Social media is a great way of connecting, but it has limitations. We're opening the fall season in Seoul with a solo show of Paolo Salvador of all new paintings, and also on the second gallery of Keon Williams, who we just started representing, and we did their first solo show with us in Milan. And we're actually going to be showing, in addition to other works, an installation that was first shown at the Hammer Museum in California. So it's going to make its Asian debut. This is a really amazing installation. So that's the kind of, the kind of way that we're thinking about shows. And then beyond the galleries, we have Rebecca Ackford having major museum shows in France and in Germany, Shuang Li at the Prada Foundation in Milan, also at the Swiss Institute in New York. We have another artist I can't say that will be doing like the collaboration with Louis Vuitton for the Capuchin bags. Also, Keon Williams will be in a major American museum show. Austin Lee at the Lotte Museum. Donna Wonka at the Farsku Foundation in New York, also Museum in Latvia. So we have a lot of interesting things happening in the gallery and beyond. I mean, we always kind of do, we always have some kind of institutional show every day of the year, happening. I don't really see our role as following trends. It's never really been what the way we operate. But what I've realized now with this like 20-year sort of history is that we've we've created the trends. Like we've identified things that then become the thing, you know, and you'll see it with the exhibitions that we do. I think that the exhibitions that we do kind of speak for themselves, and that's how we've always operated. It's not, you know, I look at everything that's going on, and we do in like the curatorial team and Nick, we look at all these things, and we're very aware. But it's not how we think. It's not part of our DNA. Like our DNA is really about discovery, and so that we discover it when we see it, you know. So it's like we don't forecast the trends in that sense, you know, but we do create them, you know. I think we are going to continue developing in this way that it was what I always envisioned from the very beginning, where we have a number of different teams, each very specialized and each working at a very high level in what they do. In other words, the writing team, the finance team, the curatorial team, the sales team, the gallery management team, and we're going to continue to go towards that direction of being highly specialized. My goal several years ago was to make myself obsolete within the gallery, and was basically to make myself, in a way, redundant. And I don't mean in that I would be completely out of the gallery, but that I would then be able to choose and pick and choose what I wanted to do, when I wanted to do it, where it would make sense. This is a way I always used to work with artists. You know, there's some artists that I've worked with very, very closely, and I mean like I'm in the studio with them. And there's other artists where I don't know where their studio is, because that's not how they work. They like to work completely alone. They don't want anybody in there, you know? And so we've always adapted to those needs. And that's very much informed on a more larger scale how we operate. And we're going to continue to develop that. So that it becomes even more a part of how we operate. And so we'll become more and more specialized, and we'll have, you know, people who really only work on sales, people who only work with like institutional projects, people who only work on the day-to-day stuff with artists, you know, people who work physically at the galleries, you know, who you interact with when you come to the galleries. Also, different teams that go to art fairs, right? We haven't really spoken so much about art fairs, but art fairs are very important marketplaces for art. And I think they'll continue to be, you know. I know we are changing a little bit the fairs that we focus on, and the regions in a way, you know, trying to really focus more on regions that we see that are you know, catalysts for what our activities are, and where we have a strong role to play, and then spending less energy and effort in the regions where we don't necessarily feel like we need to be there, you know. So like our focus really is more Europe and Asia, and I think in North America, we're probably only going to be doing our Basel Miami Beach moving forward. So we won't do any of the West Coast or other East Coast fairs in the foreseeable future. Maybe some years we'll add one or two here and there, and that can change also. You know, like there was a point where it was all about all the fairs in North America, and right now, you know, there's other galleries that are doing things there. We don't see ourselves as needing to be there. We see clients from those regions in other places. You know. Yeah. That's definitely something I do. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's one of the many things you do.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think I like that word. I like the word art dealer too. Like, I think these are valid words. They're both descriptive of, you know, what I do or what we do. But not only, you know, I think the three words I wrote curious, resilient, and steadfast. I would also probably add a fourth, being, you know, adaptable, because to me that's super important to be able to change. I think the main point of the mission, you know, of fostering the growth of independent collectors, and developing their taste, I think that is such an, I mean, it's a big task. It's a monumental task in a way, but it's at the core of, it's at the core of what we do also, actually, because, you know, we've been talking about the importance of artists, but artists are only part of the equation. We talk about the importance of galleries. Galleries are only part of the equation. There's another part of the equation, collectors. That's super important. And also collectors have become even more important over the last 20 years. There's been the rise of like the regional collectors, the mega collectors, the super mega collectors. And there's also been a rise in, you know, people who say they're collectors who are not, you know? And so this idea, I think it's a very interesting and cool idea to create sort of a place to support collectors, to build their knowledge base, you know, to build their confidence, to understand the dynamics of the world, because it's, you know, there's a lot of stuff that happens in the art world that those of us who are in it, we're like, it's normal. We take it for granted, but it's not normal in the rest of the world, you know? Of course, because of like the level of like high-end consumerism and the attention that that has received over the last years, I think a lot of people now are aware, you know, this idea of like wait list and like having to wait your turn to buy something. You know, these are things that, you know, 10, 15 years ago, when you told someone, oh, like there's a wait list for this artist, people like, any normal person would be like, what are you talking about? I have the money, I want a painting, sell me the painting. You know, and it doesn't always work that way. You know, I mean, we try to have an approach that's very client oriented. Also, we try to be very respectful of clients. You know, people are spending their money and they're trying to develop their taste and their collections with our help. And so I think, you know, VART focusing in on that, I think that's a very good place to focus on. You know, I think it's an area of advising and of advisories that I think needs more attention and more support. So good luck.